Hello, and welcome to the weekly Hoopla, where we break down the need to knows of the NBA. This week is not going to be too crazy. We just have to go over a couple of injuries, have to go through one major topic in the NBA before we jump into a couple of the teams that I think have been the most interesting since last week. And then we'll move forward into the whole tiers thing next week when we have a little more data, a little more time to see how we feel about some of these groups. Before I start, obviously, I have to do the corporate stuff here. Thank you all for watching. Please give it a thumbs up if you like it. Please give us a comment if you don't, or if you do, I don't really care. Comment section can be wild. We don't really care. Just keep it semi-PG. You know, YouTube isn't a big fan of some of the craziness. Keep the politics out of it, or be prepared to be trolled to death. That's just fair warning to you. Trolls can be trolled. Test us. Now, let's get through all that craziness and get into where we like to talk about first. We like to talk about injuries. Not because we like that injuries exist, but because we have to. And it's good to go ahead and get them out of the way early. The first one we want to start with is Alperen Sengun. He's been out with an ankle injury, suffered a pretty gnarly one this past week. This was something that kind of looked like it was going to be a scarier issue than it actually ended up being. Thankfully, Alperen Sengun will be just fine long term, but this does shut down his season. This doesn't really turn Houston's season into anything different. Of course, I know they're still trying to deal with the projected lottery pick, so they do still want to win some basketball games. But ultimately, they really don't have a shot at the play-in. No reason to even contend for the play-in. So ultimately, now it just moves into the Jalen Green renaissance. Is there something there? Is he finally finding some footing in the NBA? This will be a great opportunity for him to audition now and potentially for another team if they do decide to put him in a package to expedite their rebuild. There's also guys just on this roster that we find very interesting to look more forward to. So Houston not playing for much, but you know, their best young player, a guy who I think could potentially be an all-star as soon as next year, going down is a pretty big deal. So we're very happy to report that it's not as severe as it looked. Of course, I think he was carted off. We had an issue with getting a towel thrown at him from a poor water boy who just wanted to be anywhere else but right there at that moment. Either way, not too crazy there. We'll just go ahead and move into the guys that we're monitoring. Kristaps Porzingis has been out for 5 games with a hammy issue, and Evan Mobley's been out for 6 with an ankle issue. These guys are not new to being injured, having their bodies rested, whatever it might be. But at the same time, these guys are still very important parts of playoff teams. For the Boston Celtics, they don't really need Kristaps to finish the season out, obviously. For this group, it's going to be more about keeping the chemistry they built this season and preparing to translate that into the second season where things are much different. As for Evan Mobley and the Cavaliers, they really need him to elevate their potential right now. I think this also opens the door for a conversation about whether or not he would be the piece that ends up moving out of Cleveland if they're not happy enough with this roster and still feel like they need to make some moves in order to get Mitchell what he wants to stay long term. That's all kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Like I said, I'm just monitoring these injuries. There could be, there's plenty of time for these guys to get back, play, all that good stuff, and forget that this was ever even a concern. But with their history, with what's at stake, I found it very interesting to see those guys missing some, what I would consider significant amount of time. But that's pretty much it for the injuries there. We got our generalities here. That's pretty much just one thing this week. I'm sure there's other news in this week that maybe I should have gotten to, but ultimately this story dominated it, deserved its own, main portion of our program here today. And so we're going to talk about the thing that everybody loves to talk about, the reffing. And if you've listened to me, you've heard me talk about consistency. I think that's the word I've used the most. It's not that I have as much issue with the rules. It's that I have as much issue with the consistency at which they're being administered. I think some of the issues that I have with these guys is I know that this is an entertainment product. I know that we need to give some of the offense more leeway to have the highlight plays. But at the same time, the consistency at which we're doing it. We can't be picking favorites. We can't be falling for the same grifters things. We need to have our referees have a better feel for the live version of gaming the game, and I think that this week kind of helped us see that maybe they do, and maybe this was intentional for the NBA to show the lens of who they really are and what they're really about, or at least what they want to paint themselves as about. So this all sort of starts with a memo from the league, essentially saying no directive has been made that has shifted the game at all to where the scores are dropping. ESPN had a stat where there's 4 points per team on average difference in a game, which isn't that crazy, but it's a decrease obviously. But I think the 2 less fouls a game does seem to be a little bit more interesting there. Again, that's not the craziest number in the world, but that is a little interesting. So I think for me, that's really where I'm going to be the most focused in on. You don't see where exactly these refs would change just out of the blue. You would expect this usually to happen in off season. Usually competition committees in any league, not just this one, in any league, competition committees will put together groups that, make these decisions, hash these things out, and then in the next season we'll see changes. So for an in-season directive to come, which they say did not, would be very, very new. Be very new to the whole situation. But again, they claim none of this has happened. So what's going on? Well, apparently this has gotten big enough, not only in the scoring conversation, which I'm sure any NBA fan has heard by now, but it's gotten big enough to where they felt the need to go on Zach Lowe's podcast, they being Joe Dumars and Monty McCutcheon, one being the head of referees, the other being the ex-Hall of Fame player that's in charge of disciplinary, and I don't remember his exact title, but essentially Joe Dumars handles the disciplinary stuff as well as would be the oversight of the referees. So Zach Lowe has them on the podcast, and I've got a couple of things that I thought were very interesting to this conversation moving forward. I talk about track meet basketball a lot, and I think that it's kind of a product of the long season. Guys just aren't going to play as hard a defense because the risk of injury is just so much higher, it feels like, on the defensive end. So I think a lot of times that's what we end up seeing in the long season. Teams would rather play 130 to 120 games than grind out those other ones. And I think that's very fair. Now, obviously, shooting threes more is a factor. The talent of the game is a factor. But more than anything, the long season is the factor for track meet basketball. And I think that Joe Dumars would agree with me. Now, he won't admit it like that because, calling it too long of a season then opens another can of worms for a man in his position. But he essentially said, we don't care about the score. We care about the competition of the game. And again, I agree. You don't notice the score when the game's competitive. But competitive means on both sides of the ball, or both sides of the ball. So you're talking about competitive 130 to 130 game, that's competitive. Both teams are tight. I think the issue is that in those games, because the score has gotten so high, that usually means that we've watched a lot of Ole defense. We've seen a lot of people just getting to the rim. And because of the way the game has changed, it's easier to do that. It's not just the referees are changing the rules. It's that everyone's shooting threes now. There's spacing on the court is different. And that's, of course, where one of the rules will come into play that I'll get down to. Monty McCutcheon, he specifically highlighted consistency as being the biggest issue here. Even though he said he's seeing more progress there than before, I think that we're all pretty clear that it's not the rules that they're officiating, it's the consistency in which they're being used. There was even an example of a technical foul that they gave that Joe specifically told to Monty, I'm fine with you calling this, but it needs to be consistent. Like I said, that's going to be the key word. It's not fixing things. It's not necessarily just rule changes. It's consistency, real tangible consistency. Monty McCutcheon also noted that a lot of the political aspect of the scoring is a bit more built up in the media and in the fans and the zeitgeist, as I would say, than it is in their reality, because there's so much of basketball that, as he said, that they've got to officiate and govern, that they're constantly looking at all kinds of things, not just hyper focusing on the ones that everyone complains about. Now, again, this is what he's saying they're doing. They still have an entertainment product. They still have people to like this. The voices of the people matter to some extent. But I do understand that he was sort of brushing it off in a manner that said, "Hey, I hear you guys, but do you hear me? Like, do you understand that we have bigger fish to fry than this issue?" And it's something I've said in the past. Like, they don't really care until track meet basketball starts happening in the second, third round of the NBA playoffs. And I'm not talking about an injured team situation. I'm talking about two teams not playing defense with real stakes that's on the line. That doesn't happen usually. Teams not playing good defense in playoffs is usually some other issue other than effort. And if it is, usually that's a sign of that the whole team's going to be different the next season, right? So the stakes are higher. They just always are. He also noted that, and this is Monty McCutcheon, also noted that the possessions are down. Again, that sort of backs up the idea that if on this long season, we are now at the point post All-Star deadline where teams are starting to hyper focus on how they'll play in the playoffs. That means less men. That means less crap. That means more holding on to the ball, right? That means playing the different version of playoff basketball, which usually means less whistles and usually means less possessions. The possessions being down also helps track for why the decreases are not very significant either, just in the 4 and the 2 point difference. Essentially, you're not seeing a massive difference here. Again, it's because the possessions are down, which would track everything else, right? A great quote here: "Reffing is always going to be a half step behind the game's innovations." That was Monty McCutcheon's comment. And I thought that was a very good point to make to the general public, because there's nothing you can do. He's right. He's talking about when he got into the league, your hand checking is your big deal. You watch it slowly evolve. You see how everyone's playing in the paint. It's all clogged in there. We've got to figure out how to make this work better. Okay. Now people can shoot from distance. Now all of a sudden, this game that's right here in the, you see the backcourt right here. Everything you have right here then expands to everything you have on that line. Everything, right? The spacing gets bigger. Now the game gets bigger. The refs change. He even obviously noted the Zaza Pachulia injury in 2017 to Kawhi Leonard. So when these things happen, they have to react quickly, but it's impossible to expect them to react immediately or even in advance. Because if they did, then maybe they would have more influence on the game than they should, right? Joe Dumars also sort of said an interesting quote here to me, that he didn't deny that the pendulum had swung too far to the offensive side. I don't think that's a crazy statement. I don't think he's going out on a limb for any reason, obviously. But I do think that this is a great point to say that, we are all in agreement that the offense is just a little too tailored from the officiating side. That there has got to be some measure of movement towards helping the defense, maybe in a rule change, maybe in the consistency in the way things are called. Either way, they're going to have to figure out some sort of happier medium to get there, because even if your league executives, your top guys are having these conversations and admitting that this line is specifically, then I think it's fair to say that we all can, that there is no argument to there needs to be some better solution moving forward. Zach Lowe brought up to these guys that the teams seem to be the most pissed off about guys closing out, and how that seems to be going too heavily towards the offense, where it's, they're not having bigs contesting at the rim like they would. They're leaving open shooters because it's more dangerous to heavily contest than just hope that they miss. And so some of those things I think are very interesting to point out. I just don't really know what you do about it. And I think that was kind of the answer they ended up getting, though that did end up moving into probably the most suggested rule change that we've seen, at least from the fan side. I'm sure, including the media and the fans here. The defensive 3 seconds. Now, this is something that happens in a lot of other professional leagues. Certainly nothing wrong with it. It was sort of the reason why Luka Doncic and I think Giannis also had comments about how much harder it is to play in EuroLeague than it is to play in the NBA or score in the NBA. And again, that's a spacing situation. That means that if we have guys not camping in the lane because of the spacing, now not only are shooting, not only open threes are going to be your favorite thing, but also taking advantage of the line of the lanes to drive into to attack the rim are now obviously even more important. Where you have these 5 guys, essentially stretched out. The smartest guy cuts when they're expecting a 3. Now you've got an easy 2, right? So that sort of play, and then this was highlighted by both Dumars and McCutcheon, that they absolutely thought that one of the most important selling points that the NBA has, one of the most important differentiators between it and any other professional basketball league, is the plays at the rim. Now, if we put the defensive 3 seconds, am I still going to have a bunch of guys bold enough to attack the rim? Absolutely. But if you take that out, obviously we're going to have a lot less runs at the rim, which means less blocks at the rim, less interesting blocks at the rim. I just feel like defensive 3 seconds, I'm on the side of, in the NBA, with how dominant we can make our big men, I don't like the idea. In these other leagues where these big men sort of kind of do need a little bit of the help, I don't hate it. I think it does work for their product. I don't love it. And I think that it shows how much more interesting and how much higher level of thinking and timing these super athletes we have are, because they can still make up for these things. You'll have these moments where people will break free to the rim only to get stuffed by someone who wasn't there in the first place, because they've got the length, they've got the athleticism, they've got the reaction time to do so. And that's what, again, they're talking about is sometimes that play ends in an awesome dunk that's a poster. Sometimes it ends in an awesome rejection that seems almost unhuman. Sometimes it leads into these amazing layups with Curry. Curry's really got Kyrie. Those 2 guys are really fantastic around the rim like that. So some of the more spectacular highlights come from those plays, and the defensive 3 seconds would absolutely just drain the life out of the game from that perspective. So if you were holding out hope for that rule to be put in, I think that those 2 guys pretty much killed any hopes of that rule getting put in this version, in this regime, as they certainly don't seem very much interested. And then the final point of conversation about this is 65 games rule. That is how they ended the podcast. That seems like the NBA front office loves. Joe Dumars was very political talking about it, and always likes to make sure that he reminds people that it was collectively bargained. I've not heard him talk about it once where he doesn't start with reminding people that the players agreed to it, which probably isn't a good sign that this is actually that fair, because if you're always using that line, it kind of feels very political. And then you kind of have this issue where there's going to be some pretty dastardly snubs from the All-Star or from the All-NBA teams this year. I think Donovan Mitchell would have been a prime candidate for the first or second team, and now he's just not going to be on it, and for a real injury, and he still played so well through the time he's going to miss by the end of this. So I think it's obviously a very frustrating rule. It's one that I really don't know that I wouldn't be surprised if it changes to a 60 games played rule, a 55 games played rule in the future. But I do think that future might be a couple of years from now, after some guys have unfortunately had some taken some L's. And then, of course, this changes a little bit about Donovan Mitchell's contract, I think, potentially too, although he may already be past the need for this. But all NBA teams matter to the max salary guys more than anybody, right? So it'll be interesting to see if does this benefit the Cavs signing him long term. Does he just end up eating this? And the only excuse he can give is because he's injured. That's where I feel like, Joe Dumars can talk about how legal this is all he wants. I think that most people are not going to be satisfied with the product after one season. And I think within 3 seasons, we would probably see some sort of amendment to this rule to make it more realistic. This one, I think they said it's 20% of the games missed, essentially. And I know that number sounds great in theory, but I think watching it play out in real time in the first season shows you already. And then they're not going to use one season as enough data. So like I said, I think by 2-3 seasons from now, they'll look at this rule and say, maybe we can make a slight adjustment to it. Of course, there is some parts where, the ineligibility, but then sometimes guys are going to be eligible. So are we going to get to the end of this and then all of a sudden Donovan Mitchell is going to be eligible, even though he's not technically eligible right now? So that will make voting for these just awful. And I feel very bad for all those people that have to vote on it. That being said, NBA, if you ever wanted me to do it, happy to do it. It's just one of those things. It's a tough process, and I'm not saying there's any perfect way to do it. It's just gross. But that's the reffing the game stuff. Ultimately, I jumped ahead a little bit here. My bad. But, the game is always going to go through this cycle, most likely in this modern basketball. You're going to start this thing off with a ton of people scoring points crazy, shooting crazy to start the season, shooting awfully to start the season, right? There's always going to be those extremes of how guys get ready. Then things will pace themselves out. People will have to survive the natural issue with injury. People have to survive the natural nature of the rumor mill. And then once all of that exhausting beginning of the season starts, you get to the All-Star break. And that's basically, 70% of the season done before we actually start taking basketball very, very seriously every night. Even as fans, even as the media. I think that it's inevitably going to cause people to be frustrated. And if they're doing things for the health of the players, and if they're doing things for the consistency of the referees, I think that's all we can really ask for. I think that a lot of these were non-answers, unfortunately, and I'm not surprised. But it is what it is. This is a business. They have to watch out for their paychecks. As fans, we just want to have a game that's more consistent, more understandable. Doesn't make us sound like crazy people when we're trying to explain to other people how things are refereed, where you're just like, this is just kind of how it is. I've always talked about areas of shades of gray in basketball. There's a lot of gray area in basketball rules. And consistency is pretty much the only way we can all come together and find a product that I think makes everyone feel the best about, while keeping the players injury-free as much as possible, and while keeping the game's integrity is at the highest point. So, like I said, that was pretty much the bulk of this. We're going to go over here into the tiers check-in. We're only going to do 4 teams today, and not too deep on all of this, but it was 4 teams that I thought deserved quite a bit of attention for what's going on right now, starting with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So you're talking about a 42-25 team right now, still in the 3 seed, but they're 4-6 of their last 10. I've talked to you about the Mobley stuff. Mitchell's going to miss another game soon. His last 2 back have not been great offensively. Lost a very frustrating game to the Houston Rockets last night. So I definitely, or 2 nights ago at this point, definitely have a little bit of worry with Cleveland. But again, this is a resilient group. They've been all year. We have to give them that credit. Mitchell, like I said, has been an all-NBA first-team level talent when he's been healthy. But now, he misses this long slate. He comes back. He looks noticeably not himself. Then he's going to take a game off tomorrow. What does that look for the rest of the rest of them moving forward? That's where we're going to get a little more interesting. Of course, we're going to talk about the teams that are right on their heels, or at least one of them. You have a very, 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 very usable week in some regards, but this week could easily go 0-4, and then you're looking at yourself again, potentially on a very nasty downslide with no real clear idea of maybe Evan Mobley's long-term ability to contribute, whether Donovan Mitchell is hurt, or if he's going to have rhythm that he'll reattain in about a week or two or whatever after playing some consistent basketball again. And then you add Marcus Morris, who I find to be a perfect addition in theory, the size, the need of the position for them especially. But then you worry about the shot selection with him. And this has been routine with him throughout his whole career. He's a very, very useful player, but just does not seem to understand. He just a little too itchy of a trigger finger. And I think at this point in his career, maybe he understands that he doesn't need to do as much of that. But then you're back in a position where there's going to be times where I think he's going to get the opportunities to shoot that much of the basketball. And then that's where you get into, one game it's going to help them a lot, that the next game it's going to sink them. And I wonder how that fits into the alchemy. But either way, let's look at the games moving forward. You have the Pacers again without Mitchell tomorrow. Then you're going to have to play the Heat, the Wolves, the Heat. Heat have not been super impressive. I was hoping that they would be one of the teams that would really surge into the playoffs, but it seems like they're still going to sort of take their sweet time ramping up. But this is, their opportunity. This is their opportunity to get blood in the water. Take on the Cavaliers twice in a week span, beat them both while they're still a little, iffy. Shoot back up into those, into that top six, right? The Wolves aren't, the full healthy Wolves, but they're a very good team still. The Pacers seem to be, a very inconsistent group, but the high level is there. So very, very, very possible 0-4 here, unless, the resilience of this group sticks with it. Jared Allen has been amazing. He will undoubtedly be a first team all defensive player, maybe second team, depending on how all that voting works. So either way, I think that I'm still positive on the Cavs. I'm not worried about some, late season dive into the bottom of the basement kind of stuff. But, as positive as I've been in the last couple of weeks, now I'm starting to get a little worried for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Team that should be a lot happier, the fan base at least, the New York Knicks. You're starting to become whole again. You're 40-27. You're on the heels of the Cavaliers that we just mentioned are struggling quite a bit. 6-10 in the last 4. 6-4 in the last 10. Not awful, but still a little, little left to be desired there. Big news though is OG Anunoby's been back for 3 games. First 2 looked really nice offensively. Last night was atrocious offensively. Still made a massive impact to help them steal one from Sacramento. So now you kind of feel like, okay, this is the version of the Knicks that people were buying into. This is a rough, tough tag team. Yeah, I don't know that they have a number 1 star that gives me any sort of threat, but this is a very, very tight group. This is a very, very interesting group, the way that they form together. And as they get healthier, it could only get more interesting. So they have a great moment here. I listed more of their future games because I thought it was the most necessary for the story of how their season's about to go. But before I mention and sort of break into that, we have pretty much no clear update for Randall or Mitchell Robinson, but both seem to be progressing along as if they will play again before the end of this season, which is still sort of the interesting news here because we know with Philadelphia, that's what they're saying about Embiid, but not a lot of people feel like they want to believe it. For this situation, it feels a little more believable. It feels like there is a possibility for Julius and Mitchell to play, but can they get back soon enough to gel with this group and help it actually do some real damage in the playoffs? Or are they sort of going to, cause a bit more cluster towards the end of the playoff run, just not out of any malice, but just sort of out of the, we've got to do it for the team. I got to rush it back, but then I rush it back and it doesn't work for the team. But again, this schedule right here, the Warriors and the Nuggets, yes, obviously those 2 games will be very interesting. The Warriors are playing some of their, they've got Curry back. Let's put it that way. They've got Curry back. That makes them a much better team, much more capable of winning big games, being a tough win. Then you have the Nuggets. Obviously, there's what else can you say about the Denver Nuggets at this point? So they're still a beatable regular season team because they, just any given night. they could lose, but so any given night they could just turn it on like that and become, the dynasty they are very likely to become. The Brooklyn Nets, the Pistons, the Raptors, the Spurs, all in a back-to-back-to-back situation before you get to an Oklahoma City game that I don't remember if it's in Madison Square Garden or not. But either way, you get into a great stretch here with OG back. Like I said, even when he's not scoring offensively, you've got this great defender who is a superpower of what Thibs wants to be. He basically is Thibs on a basketball court, right? So I think that adds what the Knicks need to ascend quickly. I think the Bucks and the Celtics are probably going to lock in 1-2. Probably, the Bucks still a little, but probably going to still lock in the 2 seed there. Just need to see where the Knicks are going to go. And I think at this point, with Cleveland having some of these issues, with the Knicks getting healthy in the right time, plus the schedule coming together at the right time, if they can take advantage of it, you could be looking at a great opportunity to not only jump back into the 3 seed, but really hold on to that 3 seed and lock it in with any issues Cleveland might go through, Miami might go through, Orlando might go through, any of those things. Not going to pull an ESPN, but I am going to talk about a professional team in Los Angeles. While the Lakers are always an interesting story, in my opinion, I don't think that anything about that team isn't interesting. I don't know that I equate that with good, but it's always interesting. So people that get mad about them being on I get being upset about hearing about them a lot for the contender stuff because it doesn't track, but I do think that is pretty notable of a team for a lot of things. But that's another thing to the side. Of course, that's without managing to. I have to let you guys know that the succession's playing out with the Bus family right now. If you haven't seen the show, if you don't know what I'm talking about, for the love of God, go watch Succession and then go look up what Johnny Bus is doing. I think it's Johnny. And just gotta love people being born into a ton of money and having no expectations in life, but just to do whatever the hell they want with it. Anyway, we're talking about a different guy, Steve Ballmer, his version of this little I get to spend my money and do as I want thing, where he doesn't take it out on local politics or politics is on a grander scale. He takes it on the basketball court where we appreciate it. Spend your money where we want it. Clippers are 42-24. They're the 4th seed in the West. They've slipped a little bit. They're 5-5 in their last 10. We have injuries, not necessarily severe injuries, but we've had Paul George miss some time. We've had James Harden miss some time now. Of course, Kawhi's load managed a little bit more recently than he had to start the season. Not in a crazy amount, but just a wee bit. And so that's been a contributor. We've talked about Russell Westbrook being out for a while. We've talked about the big man situation, how PJ Tucker's going to have to start playing a little bit more. Those things are fine. We don't love them, but those things are fine. We knew that there was some progress. There was some possibility of the Clippers being just fine through all this. But, they had a tough loss to the Pelicans and the Wolves where you blow a 22-point lead to the Wolves, and then you have the Pelicans sort of, they kind of came into your, stole your thunder a little bit here. You have a Herb Jones highlight play where Paul George can essentially hit a dagger. Herb blocks it, takes it the distance of the court, and seals the game the other way. We will talk about the Pelicans. Don't worry. Again, I'm not super duper concerned, but there was a couple of things that I just wanted to point out here with the Clippers that I thought was an interesting note of, just from where we're at. This was Ty Lue asking about their competitive spirit, was asked about their competitive spirit. And he goes, so is that supposed to fall on my shoulders? I'm paraphrasing here. I'm competitive. I don't play. They know what they're supposed to do. So they've got to do it. Now, Ty isn't necessarily the Doc Rivers throwing team under the bus kind of guy, but he did coach under Doc Rivers for a little bit. And this isn't that far away from some Doc Rivers things to say. But I think for him, it's just going to be chalked up to motivating a veteran roster that knows they're in the dog days of the league, that knows kind of who they are and what they have, but that they need to be healthy and ready to play for that in 2 months. So that's probably where you get a lot of the chaos here from. At the same time, you have Bones Highland sort of coming out here, making a statement for himself, perhaps even to the extent where this costs Russell Westbrook his role on the team whenever he gets back. I kind of highly doubt it, but it's an interesting conversation to have that Bones Highland plays himself into position of being the first guard off the bench, or the six-man guard essentially. And then does that put Russ in a bad position? Is he a good teammate about it? Do they force it because he's a leader? And then it ends up kind of backfiring because then he's got to come back off of an injury, a little cold, and then trying to help this team go. And we know what Russ is like when he's cold. It can get really, really cold. So I do think you kind of have to worry a little there. But in the long scheme of things, I think that there's not too much to worry about. This team very likely doesn't slip into the play-in no matter what they do. I think at this point, you're just trying to hold on to that 4-5 matchup. I think that they probably can do that. It's just going to take a little help on some other teams' sides. And fortunately, there's some good teams coming. This week will be a good chance for the Clippers. You got the Hawks and the Blazers twice in a row, and the 76ers. Now, the Hawks have been a very feisty team, but they are definitely decimated with injury. The Blazers have been probably the best version of the Blazers they've been this entire season right now. But they're still, young, and that shows every night on the court for the most part. So they're a very beatable team. And the Sixers still obviously don't have Embiid, even though they've gotten to be a bit more consistent as a group with Tyrese Maxey taking over as the star of the show. So for winnable games, 4 games I would even argue you need because of how tight the Western Conference is right now. But ultimately, stuff that we all kind of knew about the Clippers going into this, that we all kind of worried as we went through the season. And now that we're here, the questions just kind of keep coming. And it's an exciting chapter for the Clippers next year. But I do think that, even as far as is Paul George going to be here for it, now becomes an even more dominant question. So a team that really for a moment there looked like they had snuck into the contender conversation kind of feels like they're falling back into the mid again, and then kind of feels like inevitably are going to go through some sort of remix, or are going to just keep trotting out this threesome, foursome, however you want to look at it, this LA our way group, and sell tickets and not much, and maybe not really contend for much else. So we will see. There's still a lot of talent on that roster, so I'm not gonna write them off just yet. I do worry about this particular group and what it's trying to do, and who's a free agent and who's not. The fact that guys like Bones Highland are still fighting for their lives in the NBA against guys who are fighting to just finish out their careers on their own terms. There's just a lot of that. So the Clippers have a lot of intrigue to me, and not necessarily all in ways that make me feel comfortable that they are the contenders that maybe we thought they were for a bit. And this is the final team we're going to talk about, and probably the one that I'm most interested in continuing to watch as the season finishes. Probably will be the top of my list to watch every night, as much as I can at least. And that's New Orleans Pelicans. They're 41-26. They're the Western Conference 5th seed. They're 7-3 in their last 10. And they move into a week this week that's pretty winnable, all things considered. And at the very least, will be a very interesting test of their maturity and their dedication to this season. Because for the first time in the Zion Williamson Pelicans era, it feels like a full group is on the court. It feels like a full hierarchy exists, that it should exist. And it feels like a team that is very, very close to being a very, 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 very dominant group. Statistically, they've already kind of gotten there, but I'm talking in the long term. So Zion obviously is the biggest part of this. Zion's offensively back to those incredible numbers that he was at a year and a half ago, however. Defensively, though, we've seen some very interesting stuff come out of this. In the Clippers game, he's like, I'm getting on Kawhi. I've got this. We love to see that because I think with Zion, he's going to get bullied down low. He's a big that's small. It happens. He's going to be great offensively because of who he is. But defensively, he's always going to be a little smaller than the guys around him. Fine. Figure that out with the personnel you have around him. Herb Jones is certainly a great idea. Trey Murphy, Brandon Ingram, these guys are all very lanky guys. So it sort of makes sense on how they could all protect around him. But the issue, I think, for that was Zion, Ingram, CJ. 3 historically bad defenders, or not bad defenders, average at best defenders. How do you really hold that group together with just the one guy or the 2 guys or however? And really the answer to that is these guys taking more clear steps defensively. Zion, I can guard wings. I have the elite athleticism. Let me take a Kawhi Leonard. Hell, maybe in the future, maybe even let him take some point guards. Yes, he won't be able to stop Nikola, but hey, good news, no one can. So I think that there's a couple of positives from Zion's defensive side, and then there's a massive positive from Brandon Ingram's side, because Brandon, I think in the meme team season, his last with the Lakers, I thought he really showed that as a defender, he could be very, very, very annoying. Now, he's not, he likes to get equated to Kevin Durant because they kind of look alike. He's a little significantly smaller than Durant on the height scale, but he's still a very lanky guy. And I think for that, you see why you would want to have him be very hyper-focused on defense. But because Zion's offense has always been, and the motor stuff has always been so inconsistent, whether he's in or out has always been so consistent, Brandon has more looked at himself as being the offensive superstar for this team instead of maybe the co-star and then the guy that can focus, giving himself more focus on defense. And I think that's what we're starting to see now. We're starting to see that hierarchy work. Zion, you are the offensive spark plug. You make this machine run. You go. We work around you. Ingram, you're a super talented isolation scorer. You can get your own shots. So when we need it, you go out there and cook. You go out there and get yours. But a lot of this, we're going to need your size. We're going to need your length. We're going to need your defensive intensity. CJ McCollum, we don't expect the world from you defensively. So hold up as a team unit. And then, of course, hit those shots. And it's as simple as that. And of course, over this winning streak he has. Trey Murphy, it's a similar situation. You've got a really solid group of guys around it. This Valanciunas is not perfect, but a very solid player. Larry Nance Jr. sort of helps counteract what he can't do. I still don't love the rim protection right now, but I do think it's very, very easy to, I guess in theory, it's very, very easy to look at the market next year, maybe package some of their youth, maybe package some of what they still have left in these other assets from Holiday and from the Davis trades, and put together that final piece to really make this thing click. But I love Willie Green. I love the way they've built this team. I love how much they've hit on the draft. I mean, they really have not had as many misses as a lot of teams. They've really done a great job of building. I think you got to be very impressed. And obviously, you're talking about a basketball city who's probably had, the future of their team thrown in their faces more than anyone else. Maybe the Clippers, for a while there, but really this has been the franchise most people have been just dead set on fixing, replacing, whatever. And to see it working out this well, to see them having success even with the Skellington branding that they did this year, and how much people love that, and how much it kind of feels like it adds another layer of legitimacy to the program. You just can't say enough good things. And so this week, you're going to have the Nets, who are not in a great situation. You're going to have the Orlando Magic, who are essentially the same or very similar to you in the Eastern Conference. So that's just a fun matchup to kind of give a gauge of where both of these two very talented young teams are. And then the Miami Heat, who can look like anything from complete garbage to complete title contender, before getting to the Pistons, who, we've talked quite a bit about the history of the Pistons this season. And so they're playing some good basketball. There's sort of a unspoken fight for the worst record in the NBA, whether the Pistons won it or not. It is an interesting theory, but it seems like right now they kind of would like to leave the season with Washington as the worst team. So I do expect the Pistons to try to win as many games as they can moving forward. And so you can't write it off, but obviously, if you're serious about what you're building and what this season can be, then I think the Pelicans. I think that you got to take this run and you got to go at least 3-1, and you have to go. I would say at least 2-2. I think 3-1 is a good idea. 4-0 is obviously perfect. 3-1 is really awesome, and then I think drawing even in this group, taking care of the Nets and the Pistons is most important than stealing one of those Magic Heat games. Vital. And that's pretty much it. Again, next week we'll do a full tiers ranking. Hopefully there won't be any craziness in the NBA that will happen. Hopefully I won't fall for any fake stuff, because I almost did like a whole, salute to Derrick Rose thing here just to find out that was a fake tweet. Fake tweets on a Saturday are like the most criminal, because on the regular weekday, I'm vigilant, I'm there. But on Saturdays, I'm doing other stuff. So sometimes I see that, I'm going to take it at face value. I'm not going to see, it's Adrian Wojnarowski or something, not the real thing. So frustrating there, but it happens. There, it's the era of misinformation. What are you going to do about it? But that's another week for the Hoopla. If you liked it, please bring that comment energy down below. It's great for the algorithm. Give us a thumbs up. Obviously, subscribe. Come on, man. Why are you not subscribing to the Pass the Rock Pod yet? We may even do some rebranding soon. We've got all kinds of different little tiers, subdivisions coming out. I'm just saying, it's better to get on now than later when we might have to charge you for it. That's all I'm saying.